Okay. I love it. I love these bells. Welcome back from lunch, and maybe for some a nap. I don't know. Certainly a moment to just take in all this beauty around here. It's such lovely weather here in Mepkin Abbey today. I feel so blessed that we got such beautiful weather thus far. So, all right, we're going to begin this session with, of course, a meditation by Howard Thurman, and so I think you'll really enjoy this one. Very connected to what we're going to talk about.
As long as a man has a dream in his heart, he cannot lose the significance of living. It is a part of the pretensions of modern life to traffic in what is generally called realism. There is much insistence upon being practical, down to earth. Such things as dreams are wont to be regarded as romantic, or as a badge of immaturity, or as escape hatches for the human spirit. Man cannot continue long to live if the dream in the heart has perished. It is then that they stop hoping, stop looking, and the last embers of their anticipations fade away. The dream in the heart is the outlet. It is one with the living water welling up from the very springs of being, nourishing and sustaining all of life. Where there is no dream, the life becomes a swamp, a dreary, dead place. And deep within, a man's heart begins to rot. The dream need not be some great and overwhelming plan. It need not be a dramatic picture of what might or must be someday. It need not be a concrete outpouring of a world-shaking possibility of sure fulfillment. Such may be important for some, such may be crucial for a particular moment of human history. But it is not in these grand ways that the dream nourishes life. The dream is the quiet persistence in the heart that enables a man to ride out the storms of his churning experiences. It is the exciting whisper moving through the aisles of his spirit, answering the monotony of limitless days of dull routine. It is the ever-recurring melody in the midst of the broken harmony and harsh discords of human conflict. It is the touch of significance which highlights the ordinary experience, the common event. The dream is no outward thing. It does not take its rise from the environment in which one moves or functions. It lives in the inward parts. It is deep within, where the issues of life and death are ultimately determined. Keep alive the dream. For as long as a man has a dream in his heart, he cannot lose the significance of living.
Amen. Amen. A dream in the heart. I have a dream. Sound connected? They are. So we know a lot about the connections between Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. One of the things we know is that lots of people who participated in the civil rights movement and prior to that met Howard Thurman on the pages of Jesus and the Disinherited. Bayard Rustin was one of those people. James Lawson was one of those people. And then a host of people, Vernon Jordan, Jesse Jackson, John Lewis, all of these people read Jesus and the Disinherited, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. But the connections actually begin before that. So Sue Bailey Thurman, who was Howard Thurman's second wife, his first wife died of tuberculosis. I'm sure you saw that on the timeline. And Alberta King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother, were roommates at Spelman High School, a residential high school. So even before there was a thought of Martin Luther King Jr., these two women were connected. Then, and it's not really a controversy, but in Thurman's autobiography, he talks about being a classmate of Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King. However, the research suggests that Martin Luther King Sr., or Daddy King, had started on a degree and did not finish. And Alberta King actually came from a very prominent family, minister's family in Atlanta, and they wanted him to finish school. And so he went back to finish and study at the School of Religion. This was actually during the time that Howard Thurman was teaching there, the few years that he was teaching there. So they really crossed over in that way. But we know that they were in contact. So when the Thurmans came back from India in the late 30s, one of their first visits was with the Kings to have dinner. And it's estimated that Martin Luther King Jr. was probably about 7 at the time. And even Thurman and one of the other people that he influenced, who was Vincent Harding, looked at that situation and thought, there is something else going on here that we can't even understand. However, Thurman and King Jr., MLK Jr., crossed over. Well, let me just back up and say, Martin Luther King Jr. Read Jesus and the Disinherited in a class at Crozier Seminary that was taught by one of Thurman's classmates from Colgate, Rochester Seminary, and wrote a paper on it, by the way. In his last few years of his graduate study at Boston University was actually at the same time that Howard Thurman was then appointed and joined the faculty in the School of Religion and Dean of the March Chapel. So we know that King actually attended many of his sermons and in some cases took notes. We know that sometimes some of the seminary students would sort of mimic Thurman's cadence. And I know the first time I heard Howard Thurman's voice, I thought, I've heard this cadence before. We also know that the Thurmans really wanted Martin to lead the church that they had left, that they had co-founded, the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples. So let me back up one other stage. So when the Thurmans were in India, Howard Thurman had this vision at Khyber Pass, where he saw this caravan going into Afghanistan. And in that moment, he had this vision that he felt like he was a part of those people. And what he really wanted to test was whether or not people of all kinds could worship the same God together in the same place. And so it was just something, perhaps a dream that was laid on his heart, in that moment. And in the early 40s, he was contacted by a man by the name of George Fisk, who was a professor at San Francisco State, but also hoping to find a young seminary student to help them build this church, which became the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples, or Fellowship Church. So the Thurmans, when they left, thought, well, maybe King might be able to be a good person, to pastor this church. I should say that King and Coretta did visit with the Thurmans on occasion, had dinner, and Howard Thurman and Martin Jr. also watched or listened to the World Series together. So there was some interaction between the two couples. But Martin Luther King Jr. really wanted to go back and start working on the civil rights movement in Selma and other places. And so he decided that he was going to accept the pastorate at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church there. And there's one other really important connection. In 1958, Martin Luther King Jr. was actually stabbed by a mentally ill woman in Harlem as he was signing books, and he almost died. But at that time, Howard Thurman said he had a visitation. That is a vision, and he kept seeing King's face just come up in his spirit just over and over again. So he told his wife, he says, look, I got to go to New York and find him and talk to him. And he did. He was able to locate him at Harlem Hospital, and he went and he said to King, he says, look, this thing that you are a part of, this movement, has taken on a life of its own. And I really do think that it would be wise for you to extend your period of recuperation and to seriously take some time for some silence and some solitude, and think about what your role in this is going to be. And they say that it was one of the few times that King took any time off and actually, spent some time, longer time, sort of contemplating what he was going to do with this movement. And then it was after that that he went to India and laid a wreath at the grave of Gandhi, because Gandhi had been killed by that time, and then spent some time there studying nonviolence and came back to the United States. And I'm sure it's a surprise for lots of people, because we always sort of think that it was King that met with Gandhi, but that's not how it happened. So, so there's this connection of Thurman, throughout. Certainly King wrote him a nice note saying, thank you so much, your visit was an uplift and it gave me something to think about. And the rest of it is really the history and the future. So these gentlemen there really was a connection even before King was born between these two men. But let's talk a little bit about how Thurman sort of got to a slightly different place with all of this. So as I mentioned earlier, or last night, that Thurman spent a semester studying with Rufus Jones, the renowned Quaker mystic. And one of the things that Jones introduced to Thurman was this idea about different kinds of mystics. And he had this notion that there were negation mystics and affirmation mystics. Negation mystics were those who chose to isolate themselves and to pray and to live in oftentimes cloistered communities. But he felt like there was another kind of mysticism where one could experience the presence of God in what is considered to be the finite. It might be outside, it might be in a vision, it might be in worship, but this is kind of like an opportunity for a mystic to live in an everyday community. And he felt like when you go down into this presence of God, you come up in community or our common unity or oneness. So Thurman was very interested in this idea, and particularly because both Jones and Thurman had these mystical experiences as young children. And it wasn't until Thurman started studying mysticism formally that he had a vocabulary to explain what he had been experiencing all along. But one problem that he had with Jones was that Jones was very much into being a pacifist, into anti-war efforts, but he didn't seem to be able to comment on the domestic problem of discrimination and segregation. And Thurman would ask him, and he would just sort of switch the topic or talk about something else. And it was very interesting, too, that some of the Quaker schools, colleges, were the last to desegregate. So this was sort of an issue for Thurman, because he's like thinking, okay. But in a lecture that he gave in 1978 as part of this course on mysticism and social change, this is what he says. He's about Jones. He says, first, he helped me define and give a name to experiences that were part of my life ever since I can remember. Second, he introduced me to the concept of mysticism, which concept was completely foreign to my whole frame of reference. When I got it, I had a handle now, and a handle that is important. Another contribution that he made to me was to help me block out the territory that for the rest of my life I would be exploring. So I tolerated my feelings and forgave me of my negative feelings because he didn't seem to ever be able to get off the dime and deal with or make Quakers practice religion with the Negroes. I just forgave him. Later, he says, in his presence, you felt that you were a great spirit, which is something was also a comment made about Thurman. I will always love him because he opened a way in my thinking and will always be identified with that way. I have no interest in whether my thoughts and his thoughts clash or are one. All that is irrelevant. But he opened up a way for my heart as the only other great teacher that had opened up a way for my mind. So even though he didn't agree with Jones on everything, he did understand that he had basically created a major opening for his thinking and for his talking about mysticism. One of the interesting things was that Thurman basically decided that what he needed to do was that he needed to expand this notion of mystics and mysticism. Part of the problem was, of course, that, you know, for many people then and for now, just to say the word mysticism just brings up all kinds of things, right? Usually people are so associated with the occult or something, some kind of devil worship, etc. And he came to understand that that was obviously not true. He also was criticized by many Black religious leaders and political leaders because they're like, what is this mysticism going to do for us? Really, I mean, it's not very practical. You know, we need something that's liberating. So he decided that he would start to really think about mysticism in a different way. And so one of his first actually written documents was produced in 1939, where he talks about sort of 4 different types of mystics. One group consisted of Catholic, Protestant, and some Hindu mystics who he felt see mystical experience as part of their personal relationship with God. God breaks through the veil to bring them a special message. Their encounters might lead to more prayer and intimacy with God. And he considered Christ mystics, that is, those who have had mystical experiences around Christ, as a subset of this group. He also felt like there was a second group of mystics who hold a more intellectual sense of the infinite In this particular group would be some Greek philosophers and some early Christian theologians, or the way of the Tao, Neoplatism, Spinoza, and the Kabbalah would belong in this group. And these people really want to dissect the experience, understand how it happens, and what does it mean about God and the mystery of life. And then he said there was a third cluster, what he called the light within mystics, which believe that the divine rays of light reside within everyone, and that they must obey the conviction of the still small voice of the Holy Spirit inside. Thurman would include himself in this group, along with most Quakers and Meister Eckhart. And it is actually the actions of the light within mystics that often link mysticism and social action. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the fourth category included mystics who associate themselves with the occult, and those that deal with magic or attempt to acquire occult powers through numerology or other kind of psychic endeavors. But he felt that, in the end, he felt that he didn't really like to call it mysticism. He didn't like to actually be called a mystic. That he felt like mysticism, as we often describe it, was just another form of religion. And he would prefer to call it a religious experience or a creative encounter with God. Hence his book, The Creative Encounter, which really sort of details in part his ideas about mysticism. And not only did he think about it as a religious experience, but he felt like every time you have a connection or a contact with the presence of God, it should change you. And he's writing this book in the 1950s, and he's talking about neurotheology, what we call neurotheology now. Basically, that every time you are making that connection, it is changing your entire nervous system. And that it should also then filter down into the ways in which you move through the world and interact with other people as a result. So, his ideas about mysticism were basically, your response to God. And he was really trying to actually make it a little bit more palatable or a little bit more accessible to everyday people. Because one of the problems with mystics and mysticism is that they often try to describe an indescribable experience. And so it just adds to the confusion that people have about what mysticism is. But he was particularly interested in this kind of affirmation kind of experience where, as he said, when you go in and connect with God, you are connecting with community. That's what he called it. But which is equivalent to the unity of all, the connection of all. So this was really sort of an important sort of introduction to the discussions on mysticism. People started to, if they read Thurman more deeply, to understand that there was something about this connection with God and something stirring in you to eliminate the barriers, whether they were inward or outward, between every individual and God. So things like segregated churches, or things like segregated living accommodations, etc. That those kinds of things are all just, he considered to be barriers that human beings interpose in God's creation. And he was always in pursuit and always trying to encourage people to begin to participate in the restoration of God's beloved creation. It was far beyond sort of our general notion of beloved community. Like the beloved community really is the beloved creation, which would then include nature as well. And so I think that this was really an important connection. He was, however, by the way, he was present for the March on Washington. He was highly criticized, by the way, for not participating as someone marching in the streets. But one of the things that Howard Thurman understood was that his call was not to be Martin Luther King Jr. His call was to be Howard Thurman. And he utilizes a notion, which I'm going to play a meditation about this in just a second, utilizes this notion of inner authority to make a determination about what's his call and what is somebody else's call. Now, I should also mention, though, that we see this connection between mysticism or between contemplation and action, even in the work in the ways in which they train people for the civil rights movement. That is to go inward before you confront outward violences. And also, if any of you saw the movie Selma, you know that there was a point at which King kneels down on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, takes a moment, and turns everybody around, because that was not the time. So, I want to talk about this notion of inner authority, but I want to play this first.
There is in every person an inward sea. And in that sea there is an island. And on that island is an altar. And there stands God over that altar, the angel with the flaming sword. And nothing can get by that angel to be placed on that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority upon its brow. And what gets by the angel with the flaming sword and is placed on your altar, on your island, in your sea, becomes a part of what a friend of mine calls the fluid area of your consent, the center of your consent. And what becomes the center of your consent is your connecting link with the eternal.
Amen. Amen. So each of you has a copy of this meditation in your packet, whether you're online or here in person. And this is really an important one in having us understand this idea of inner authority. Lots of people have talked about inner authority in different sorts of ways. In psychology, we immediately think about Carl Jung and his idea of agency. It's that moment when you wake up and realize you have agency. You can decide what you're going to do or what you're not going to do, what you're going to let into your inward center, and what you're not going to let into your inward center. Even though we sometimes think that others have the power over us, one of the things that Thurman is inviting us to in this meditation is this idea of utilizing your inner authority. Just because someone may say something about you does not necessarily mean that you must internalize that and make it a part of your self-concept or who you think you are. And part of living, but particularly for people who are disinherited or dispossessed, is this idea that this person is defining who I am. And I'm feeling badly because they told me that I'm worth less than they are. And so he invites us to really think about this notion of inner authority. And where is it, and who has really control over your inner life. Now remember, the comment in Jesus and the Disinherited about as long as someone can hurl an insult at you or something to throw you off your equilibrium, you will always be under their subjection. He is talking precisely about this and about trying to strengthen your inward center by recognizing, one, that you're a holy child of God, and two, that you have control, you have power over what you're going to let into your fluid area of consent. And of course talks about this in terms of linking this with the eternal. And so for Thurman, interiority is where the action is. One of the questions that he often poses, not necessarily directly, is, what do you know of your inner life? During the pandemic, I had a few of the people I companion, come on, and some people out there in the streets, and say, one woman said, I'm so upset, I'm screaming at the television. And I said, okay. I said, so who's in control of your inner life? Is it you or the person that you're screaming about? So what's really key here is perhaps maybe we need to become more acquainted with our inner life. How would you describe it? Who's controlling it? Are you living in calm or turbulent seas inside there? So some people would say, well, I don't know, that sounds impossible. Who can change their inner life? Well, Thurman would probably say you can change your inner life. But you have to be aware, one, that you have one, and two, that you have control over it. So in one way, he's talking about this inner authority, which he basically lived out. Thurman, when his professor said to him, I don't think you should waste your time on social issues like race, Howard Thurman said, okay, thank you very much. But I'm probably not going to be doing that. And what he found actually was that he could do both. He also left a tenured job at Howard University to go start a church. He had no idea how he was going to support his family, or whether or not this church was going to be successful. But people were like, why are you doing this? This is horrible. You're depriving great students from your wisdom and, all the work that you're doing. Howard Thurman utilized his inner authority to say, I'm going to start this church. Also, and one of the examples that I use is that when I was a little girl, if my mother walked into a store and the clerk addressed her as a girl, she turned around and walked out, which is, by the way, a derogatory way of addressing a black woman. And I mean, I'm at 4 or 5 years old watching this. She was utilizing her inner authority, which is that I am not going to participate in this disrespect. I'm walking out the door. That's a utilization of inner authority. There's no violence there. It's just, this is what we're doing. So there's all kinds of ways. Certainly Thurman got a lot of this from watching his mother and his grandmother as they moved in and out of their community. I know that Thurman, when he was about 13 or 14 years old, wanted to join the church, and of course, you had to have a conversion experience. And he went and told the deacons what his conversion experience was, and they just rejected it and said, well, you're not ready. So his grandmother marched him right back down there and said, hey, excuse me? All male deacon board, this is what's going to happen here. So he got lots of illustrations of use of inner authority as a child. And then, of course, he was highly, as I said, criticized for not participating in the streets, in the civil rights marches and demonstrations. But Howard Thurman really did believe that he was called to hold the spiritual space, to provide a spiritual sanctuary for those who were coming in and out of there. And so he became like the mentor for everybody, right? Jesse Jackson, and talks about just kneeling at his feet. John Lewis, all of them would go and talk to him. And, he would ask them very poignant questions to help them understand, like, why are you doing this really? So this use of inner authority is really, I think, important. However, there is also another kind of inner authority, which I capitalize inner authority. So inner and authority are both capitalized. And that is what it is that we find when we begin to talk about sacred activism. So activism, whatever kind it is, social, political, etc., becomes sacred activism when you invite the Spirit in for guidance. You invite the Spirit in to discern what it is that you are going to say, where you're going to go, and when you're going to go. Because Thurman would argue that God is always on the side of unity, of wholeness. So if in fact there is something interrupting that, then it is for each of us, it is important for us to understand what is our sacred call in all of this. It's not the same. And as we look at the civil rights movement and other movements in other places, not everybody's on the street. There are people cooking meals. There are people taking care of children. There are people behind the scenes. I won't tell you the number of people filing legal briefs and getting people out of jail. Everybody had something to do. And so it is, in part, you're listening for your call as to what is your call? Why are you here? What is your part in all of this? So sacred activists, and I can name them from the beginning of time: Moses, Jesus, Joan of Arc, Harriet Tubman, Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King Jr., Olive Schreiner. The list just goes on and on and on of people who actually either heard a call or discerned a call or put it out there about what it is that they needed to do. There's a lovely book, by the way, written by Joy Bostick about African-American female mysticism in the 19th century. And she really focuses on three women: Jorina Lee, Zelphia Edwards, and Rebecca Cox Jackson. And these were women who actually were called to preach. They had a vision, etc. But women were not welcome in the pulpit. So they decided that they were going to preach anyway. Zelphia Edwards actually went to Europe and preached. Jarena Lee preached wherever anybody would welcome her. So, people have different calls, and oftentimes they are certainly not necessarily aligned with what it is that we normally associate with what is conventional at the time. And so the question that comes up is, what is our relationship with the Holy Spirit? Where do we allow the Spirit to guide us? And what are the things that we keep away from the Spirit because we want to do it, we want to do what we want to do? Thurman would say, if you are really carrying the mystical consciousness with you everywhere you go, then you are going to surrender the nerve center of your being to God. And, one of the funny things, because I do occasionally get what I call covert mystics in spiritual direction. These are people who are having mystical experiences, but they don't want to share it with anybody because they're afraid. They're going to get ostracized or get kicked out of something or whatever. And I remember I was talking to one young man, and he gave me this beautiful experience. And so I said, well, so do you consider yourself a mystic? And he said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, part of that is that, and I said, well, so what's the hesitation? He said, well, I'm not sure if I'm ready to give up all that control. So the question is always, are you willing or are you going to be willful? That is one that Gerald May poses in his book, Will and Spirit. Willing or willful? Those are that's sort of the dichotomy there. And so I think that's the thing that sometimes stops a lot of people, is that they're not ready to give up control to the Spirit. They're not ready to give up control to they're not really ready to surrender to God. For real. So, so one of one of my favorite passages in the Bible is that conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus about, what does it mean to be born of the Spirit? Part of being born of the Spirit is to allow the Spirit to guide and direct you in all that you do. Thurman was very much into this idea as well of inner authority. I should say on a personal note that, I've had a heart transplant for 27 years and a kidney transplant for 17. And I have utilized lots of inner authority to be able to stay alive. Because there are times when doctors have it right and times when it's like, oops. And so being able to stay connected to that so that I know when to say, okay, I guess we're going to have to do this. And, you're in that OR and they're counting down from 10 and you just have to say, I hope I wake up from this. Or the time when, you realize that you need to have surgery and you need to go in and convince the doctors that they need to do something. Or the time when they want to do something that you have heard, this is not a good idea. So it really changes things when you have cultivated this relationship with the Holy Spirit, and you're able to then step out there. I mean, it's almost like not even on faith. It's actually on a rock, right? But it's hard to hold on to that, at the time. So I sort of feel like I have been able to survive and thrive because I'm listening and I'm not making every decision myself about anything. And so in some ways what it allows for is an inner freedom. Even though it doesn't feel like freedom to some people because they're like, I'm letting go of control. But in some ways, it's free to not have to worry about every single thing that's happening. So you've got other kinds of examples. Harriet Tubman is a great example, even though she got sort of hit in the head. Who knows what that unleashed. But she basically used discernment for every move that she made in freeing slaves and going back and get them. It's just really, really amazing. And I think that as we begin to think about sacred activism on a much larger scale, because, as I talk to people about, being activists and being out there, so many of them are burning out because there's no spirituality undergirding their work. And that's what sustains activism, because then you're participating in something much larger than the current event that you're involved in. So, of course, Thurman he retired in 1965 from Marsh Chapel, and of course had a wider ministry where he continued to pursue these issues of how do we continue to create opportunities for community, for common unity, for people being able to connect across whatever, as he called them, artificially interposed barriers that exist. And I think he left us that legacy. He sort of threw down the gauntlet for us to pick up and carry on, so that we each can listen for our sacred call and do what we are here to do to help restore that beloved creation. And for some, that might be environmental justice or climate change in those areas. Or it might be for, more gender equality. There's just so many different areas. But I think we each have one with the talents that we're given. Obviously, Thurman was given talent beyond measure. That is a gift of this sense of presence of God from a young age. And what did he do with it? He worked for God. He basically, said, I'm working for God as a mystic to do this work out in the world. And so I think we each are here on some mission. And I think what he is calling us to is to begin to listen for our sacred call and then utilize our both inner authority and capital inner authority to accomplish that. So I want to quickly play a final meditation here. Let's listen to this. Me and my lovely speaker that turns itself off.
I will sing a new song. The old song of my spirit has wearied itself out. It has long ago been learned by heart, so that now it repeats itself over and over, bringing no added joy to my days or lift to my spirit. It is a good song, measured to a rhythm to which I am bound by ties of habit and timidity of mind. The words belong to old experiences which once sprang fresh as water from a mountain crevice fed by melting snows. But my life has passed beyond to other levels where the old song is meaningless. I demand of the old song that it meet the need of present urgencies. Also, I know that the work of the old song, perfect in its place, is not for the new demand. I will sing a new song. As difficult as it is, I must learn the new song that is capable of meeting the new need. I must fashion new words born of all the new growth of my life, my mind, and my spirit. I must prepare for new melodies that have never been mine before, that all that is within me may lift my voice unto God. How I love the old familiarity of the wearied melody. How I shrink from the harsh discords of the new untried harmonies. Teach me, my Father, that I might learn with utter abandonment and abiding enthusiasm the fresh new accent, the untried melody, to meet the need of the untried morrow. Thus I may rejoice with each new day and delight my spirit in each fresh unfolding. I will sing this day a new song unto thee, O God.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, let us take about 10 minutes for a break here. That should put us at 3:04. No, not 3:04. Yeah, 3:04. Is that right? 3:04. We'll come back. All right. So I want to give you a couple of minutes to look at the questions under session 3. As you'll see on your reflection questions, retreat reflection questions, spend about maybe 10 minutes just focusing on those two. And as you can see, I have personal reflection questions for you that you can take with you as you go back home to be thinking about in the days, weeks, and months ahead. I put at the bottom some famous quotes by Howard Thurman. So let's just take the next 10 minutes till maybe 3:17 to just personally reflect on just this last session. Session 3, is it possible to be an ordinary or everyday mystic or a mystic activist? Are you a covert mystic? Have you had mystical experiences but were afraid to tell anyone? And who do you see as a sacred activist or sacred activist? Where are you being called to contribute, to foster reconciliation and help restore and sustain God's beloved creation? So just sit with those for about 10 minutes, and then we'll break up into small groups. One of these days I'll learn how to hit that. And ready or not, we are back. Live. So, here we are. We've been through a day with Howard Thurman. And I should mention to those who are online, you might consider doing a Lectio yourself on Howard Thurman's either the Inward See or the Strength to Be Free, which you have in your packets, I mean that were emailed to you. And we're going to do that tomorrow here. And so I'd like to hear about questions, particularly about this last section on mysticism and social change. We don't usually think about them in the same sentence. So to think about them being connected is unusual. So I'd like to hear more about what you've been thinking and talking about. There are questions online or comments.
I was thinking about inner authority, and it sounds hard, but it sounded like, okay, I can do that. And then I started to think about times when people can't. At first it seemed like people couldn't do that. And I was working with a group on looking into scientific studies of contaminated soil that particularly affects, or contaminated environment that particularly affects marginalized communities, and the liver cancer rates going up. And so there's a focus on this with this study NIH is doing that hopefully will affect public policy. So that's a really big thing, but I feel for the people who are living in these places with contaminated soil, because it's lower priced land and it's just where lower income folks can live. Do they have the inner authority? First I was thinking, no, they don't have the inner authority to change that. Where'd they live? But then I realized what you were talking about, the inner authority, just to have a shift in how we carry ourselves in disharmony, in a place of disharmony. Not quite articulating that right, but it's how we have our spirit can also be an inner authority, right? Even though I might not be able to change my outer circumstances. So I sort of answered my question, but I wanted to just throw that out at you, because some situations are just so
Absolutely.
detrimental to
Absolutely.
life.
Yeah, so the comment was about inner authority and many disenfranchised people living in areas where they have contaminated ground soil that can lead to liver cancer, et cetera. And how do you exist in those conditions? With inner authority. And of course, one of course is perhaps maybe thinking about what you individually can do. But people ask questions all the time about, well, so how can you choose a vocation that is against family dictates? Or how do you leave an abusive relationship? Or how do you get another job if you have someone who is really, abusive, et cetera? And that's where the capital I inner authority comes in. It's when you ask the Spirit, what is it that I can do about this situation? And I think one of the things that we don't often consider are the masses of people who left the South, right, as part of the Black migration. People leaving Ukraine right now. I mean, obviously that's not an opportunity for everyone, but for those who have that sense, I'm not going to stay here, I am going to find another way. People seem to have found another way. I mean, I think I am here right now because my parents decided to leave the South during the Black migration. And there are many others as well. So, it's very interesting because on the one hand it seems impossible, but on the other hand, people seem to have found a way.
But then there's some people who wanted to get on the plane in Afghanistan and didn't make it.
Right.
And so it's like, what is that? The inner authority is, and an inner shift, maybe.
Yes. Yes, I mean, okay, so, and there you are. Or it's just like, I was destined to have a heart transplant. So what do I do? Do I decide, well, never mind, and I'm out of here? 30 years ago? Or do I say, okay, I think I'm going to jump on this roller coaster and see where it goes?
We're glad you did.
We are.
Well, I'm just not the chicken type, I just thought dying would be too chicken, right? I guess I'm going to have to do this. But I did some discernment as well, I remember putting it out there saying, okay, God, if you want me to have this for transplant, show me a sign. And did I get one? Yes, I did, right? And even had a mystical experience around it, where a presence, I woke up and a presence was in the room and told me exactly when I needed to go on the list. And I was on the list for 4 days. So I just don't think, and this is not a blame thing, I think we need to utilize our spiritual resources more. Because oftentimes we make an assumption based on the facts. And the facts are the facts, but they're not everything. It's almost as if there's another, I won't say parallel universe or reality going on, but there is another reality. And so how do we tap into that so that when we need it, it is available to us? I think it's real important to practice discernment regularly about little stuff. What should I have for dinner tonight? Or, do I really need to go to this event or do I need to stay home? I mean, we do have choices, but sometimes working with Spirit gives us an additional edge, sort of able to see around the corner in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. But I'm with Thurman about the more practice you have, the better it gets, right? So, and when you think about it, in any given 16-hour day that you're awake, how much time do you really give to God? Really? How willing are you to sit for 15 or 20 minutes, and just give that time to God in trying to connect? And that famous story about, the person went to the monk and said, how long should you meditate? And the monk said, everybody should meditate at least 20 minutes a day, an hour if you're busy. And that, I believe that, as well as when you're in a difficult time, pray more. Some faith traditions have it on Christians by a long shot in terms of how often they pray. So, when I was doing the finishing edits on this book, I was praying on the hour. I was praying the Psalms, right? On the hour, because it was really challenging. So instead of sort of feeling like God has abandoned us in challenging times, maybe we need to draw closer so that we can tap into that vitality, that power that is there. The strength, we listened to that meditation this morning. The Lord is my strength. How often do we act that out? But see, I think young children, and there's a lovely book called The Spiritual Child by Lisa Miller, and she talks about children being naturally spiritual. And then they go to school. Mm-hmm. And that sort of part of them gets kind of schooled out. It's like, don't trust that, trust the facts. And so I think it's time for us to get back to that connecting with Spirit, who is always available 24/7 to help guide us if we would just pause. And I've also noticed, this was many years when I read Women Who Run with the Wolves, that the first thing that many animals do when they don't know what's happening is they get still. They just freeze. And just think if we were the same way, instead of reacting, just let me take a moment. What do I need to do in this moment? So,
I think some of the prayer circles, especially that women have been involved in through the years, have been extremely powerful in sustaining for them during hard times. Something that men don't necessarily gravitate to, but this prayer circles of women that I've known about through the years have struck me now and looking back as being very mystical and in helping the whole group, as well as the individuals in there, where they become a force to be reckoned with within their church or community.
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely correct. He was talking about prayer circles and the importance and how they've been so important for many women. I think one of the difficulties that men have has to do with independence, autonomy being associated with masculinity.
Yeah.
And so, when you're constantly trying to be independent, I'm going to be independent, this idea of connecting, this idea of allowing something else to direct you is just foreign. So, in many ways, it's very natural for women to come together because they don't have that disconnection when they are individualizing or individuating themselves as they get older. So, yes, prayer circles. And, there are now many contemplative and centering prayer circles all over the place. These are things that we can either create or we can involve ourselves with other people, in those kinds of circles. Other comments, questions?
I have two that are online, and they're both simply thank yous. One says, thanks for offering this wonderful opportunity. And the second one says, this has been very helpful for my work in social justice. We'll share with colleagues. We've been talking about grounding our work from a contemplative base.
Ah, fabulous. I'm very excited about that. Because like I said, I've talked to a lot of burnout activists. And they're burning out because they're not connecting to like the universal source of vitality. And to me, that's really where the action is being able to go back, as to use Thurman's language, again and again and again, right? To go back to connecting with the presence of God, to be able to quiet down so that you are engaging in spiritual renewal, so that you then have the strength, the resolve, the vitality to get back out there.
But to talk about how that happens in community, I find myself wanting to talk about communal empowerment. You say anything along that line?
Oh, absolutely. Which is why, he had these times of silence in his worship, because it was that corporate worship, corporate quiet that he felt that was giving people the opportunity for healing in that time. But he was definitely very much into communal silence, communal contemplative prayer, and felt like there was great power in that as well. And, if he were still living, I'm sure he would say, when are you all going to start incorporating this in your worship? What are you waiting for? And I think sometimes there are many pastors who are afraid that if people have a direct experience of God, they're going to not come to church. Right? I mean, it's that surface level thinking.
That's beautiful.
And Thurman would argue that it is that connection with spirit, with presence of God, that wants you to then be part of community. It is the thing that stirs you to then join with other people. But logic. It's really unfortunate, but and I suspect, particularly now, you would have more young people, more people, period, coming to church because they want an experience of God. And they want spiritual community. They're not getting that at church, which is why they're going to retreat centers like this and all over the country. And often I hear from directors of retreat centers that, oh yeah, we're creating the spiritual community that people aren't getting at church. And And if they were creating the spiritual communities at church, they wouldn't have people going out looking for it someplace else.
Question. You mentioned that Dr. Thurman was really focused on this idea of the oneness of people. Where does that emerge in the arc of his writing? Is it present in Jesus and the Disinherited? Is that where, or does it come later in his thought?
Well, he was certainly thinking about it. I think Jesus and the Disinherited was really his attempt to address the plight of his people. It's like, how do we get people out of these circumstances? How do we help them to find their authentic selves and not this self that society has constructed for them, right? So and what are some of the things that are keeping them back? Fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, right? So that was sort of the groundwork there. But like I said, he's always working on multiple fronts at the same time. Because in 1939, he's first beginning to write about mysticism and social change. So this idea of mysticism and social change he's working on that at the same time. And so you see more evidence of that in his later writings. You see some of it in Deep is the Hunger. You see some of it in, obviously, Creative Encounter, In Search of Common Ground. And I think he tries to pull it all together in sort of Disciplines of the Spirit. Again, returns to this ideas of, what is it that we really need? Well, we need commitment, we need prayer, we need reconciliation, all those things. So like I said, if you follow his sermons, he's actually, in lectures, he's actually talking about these things at the same time. And interestingly, whatever he wrote about, there's going to be a sermon about it or a lecture about it someplace. So if you get up on the website at Boston University or on the website even now at Emory University, they have a small collection of recordings. You will find, for example, he gives 12 sermons on Jesus and the Disinherited, 10 years after it's published. He gives a number of sermons and lectures on the Creative Encounter. So you can actually listen to him giving those lectures. He's got, sermons and lectures on, In Search of Common Ground. And In Search of Common Ground is actually a book that he wrote after Martin Luther King died. And people were just so distraught and disheartened. And they were like thinking, well, what's going to happen now? And, his position was that it's not all in this one person, right? This spirit is still alive. He also writes a book which doesn't get a lot of attention, The Luminous Darkness, about how does he describe it? Basically about segregation and how evil it is. And it's evil for everybody. Not.
Did you write that? Do you recall?
It's on the sheet.
Before King came along?
No. But it's sort of happening at the same time. There's just this idea of, why are you pulling apart God's people like this? So he talks about it being poisonous for both the people that are being, on one side or the other. And interestingly, many of you may be aware of Wendell Berry's book, but Wendell Berry has a very interesting book called The Hidden Wound. And this is about the wound to white people about segregation and racism. The Hidden Wound. So, there are a number of people that, write about how whatever this is basically poisoning everybody. And it really needs to be healed. And so let me just take 1 second to say this. As a person who used to teach classes on self-concept and identity formation, ethnic identity formation. You have to understand, I said this earlier, infants arrive here knowing nothing about who they are with respect to race, gender, religion, none of that. So what they learn, what they are taught, and what it means over time becomes what they know. But it's not necessarily true. And so it's being able to, and that's why Thurman says you can only have love between freed spirits. Once you are free of the meanings that you've internalized about race, about gender, about social status, about power, then, because he says we all live under the scrutiny of God. And to God, none of that matters. It doesn't matter whether or not you are male or female, Christian, non-Christian, none of that. Stripped of all these things, you are a spirit living in the presence of God. We kind of made that other stuff up. And I could venture with you, we could talk about why, why it is, why does it seem to be human nature to create hierarchies and to see differences and to attach value to those differences. But that's what we do all over the world. It's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. And how do we begin to break out of that so that we see everybody else as a holy child of God and we see our connection to everything? That really is part of, I think, the journey.
Well, you've certainly given us some clues how to break out of it, Lerita. And it's time for us to say goodbye to our Zoom participants and to thank them for joining us for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.